Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to work on the sleeves for this particular gown. I cut them out earlier, 2 layers of linen lining and 2 layers of fashion fabric. And today I have 2 cameras set up, so there will be picture in picture. The iron's hot. Let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is stitch that little dart on both the lining fabric and the fashion fabric. And just to remind you that I'm waxing my linen thread, and then I am running it through the iron to set the wax. And I'm just pinning my dart together. So that it doesn't move around on me. And I'm just using a running stitch. I've got a knot in the end of my thread. And I'm just going to do a single back stitch there to hold it in place. And then just a very small little running stitch. And every once in a while I will do a back stitch to lock it. Can you see that? If I hold it really carefully and still, maybe. It's a bit difficult to see on white fabric on white stitching on white fabric, about as much as it's difficult to see black stitching on black fabric. And I'm going all the way to the end of the fabric again. You don't want to end the seam on that other stitching line. And I'm just going to take 2 little back stitches and do a knot at the end of my stitching line. Now, I've got a little dart here. You can see it there. What I'm going to do is, where that fold is, I'm going to cut right on the fold. And I'm going to use the small side of my scissors to get up in that point as closely as possible, but not going through my stitching line. So up to, but not through. And there we have it. And I'm going to press this open. So there's my little elbow dart. And that's what it looks like on the inside. So what I'm going to do now is all 4 pieces the exact same way, stitch up the darts, slit them open, and press them open. I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, now that all my darts are stitched and pressed open, I'm going to fold under my seam allowance and press it on the sleeve end edge. And I'm doing a little trick where I'm stretching out that curve as I'm pressing and easing in this curve here. So I'm stretching out this curve and I'm easing that curve as I press. And that little maneuver just takes practice. And you could do samples. To practice your pressing. That one's done, that one's done, that one's done. One more. As I'm going around the lower elbow curve, I'm not going up into the body of the sleeve. I'm just pressing the very edge of the fold. And then when I go to stretch out this curve, I'm going up into the body of the sleeve a little bit more. And I'm using lots of steam. So there are all my curves in place. Now what I'm going to do is match up my sleeves so that they are wrong sides together. And so that my linen is just shy of my fashion layer and my dart points are matched up. So just shy. Dart points are matched up. There you go. Once I get the two hem edges of the sleeve pinned together, I'm going to fell them. I'll be back in just a second. Okay, so both my sleeve hem edges are pinned in place, and I'm going to prep my thread to begin felling that hem. Some days are better than others at threading needles. And some days you just have the wrong needle in your hand. I've knotted my thread in the end there, little tiny knot, and I'm going to come up in the lining and hide that knot. And just like felling before, I'm going to use my finger to feel the process. I'm going to go down and take a prick stitch from the fashion layer and come up and pick up the fold of the lining layer. And then I'm going to go down and prick stitch the fashion layer and come up and pick up the fold. And I'm only picking up the fold of the lining. And I'm going back into the fashion layer almost where I came up from the fashion layer. The fell stitch is probably one of the most useful stitches you're going to learn when you take up historical sewing. It does so many things so beautifully, and it's so quick. And I'm sewing really slowly right now, just so that you guys can see what I'm doing. So I'm going in, picking up a prick of the fashion layer and coming up, and just picking up the fold of the lining. I have other videos that just show the felling stitch. Pierre will put a link probably multiple times in these videos. Okay, so both hem edges are finished. That's what they look like. And you'll notice that there's a bit of a cup to that sleeve. We want that cup there. I'm not going to press it out. And that's so that it cups the elbow nicely. Next, we are going to stitch the sleeve seam. And I'd like you to consider which direction your sleeve seam is going in, because we want to fool the eye into thinking that the arm is nice and thin and snug. So you want the fold of your seam to go towards the back of your arm so that your eye is not distracted by the seam. If the fold goes towards the back of the arm, the eye just makes the seam disappear. Okay, so that's the back of the arm there, that part. This is the front of the arm. So what I want to do is fold under this forearm sleeve. And I'm going to do that with the iron as well. And it's going to be a little difficult here where this seam is sitting, and you're just going to smush it the best way you can so that when the seam is done, it'll look like that. And I'm giving it a good press with some steam. Okay, so you have one side that's folded and one side that is not. And you're going to take the folded and encase the unfolded. And I want to encase both the fashion layer and the lining layer, making sure that you're matching up down at the hem edge. Move that so that you can see it there. I'm matching it up down here at the hem edge. Everything's going to be encased. And take a few minutes to get this pinned nicely. Feel all of the layers. And make sure that you're going through them all evenly and nicely. And use as many pins as you need. And you may find it easier to just slip a ruler in underneath. I can feel my ruler there. And everything's nice and flat, and I'm going to pin through all of the layers using the ruler as my pivot point. To get everything pinned there nicely. And if I was to carefully show you the inside, that's what it would look like. Don't have enough thread there on that piece, so I'm going to start another thread. I'm going to knot my thread. And I'm going to come up underneath the fashion layer, very close to the edge of the hem, and I'm going to hide my knot. Take a few minutes to get it really in there nice and tight. Now what we're going to do is through all of the layers, we are going to work a back stitch. And it's going to be a spaced back stitch. And we're going to use our finger on the other side to guide the needle. And this first bit, you're going to go through a lot of layers. So if you need to stab, and come back up, you can do that too. But then once you get past all of those layers, you should be able to just use your underside finger there, forefinger, to guide your sewing needle. And you're going to be stitching through all of the layers at the same time. This is why it's so important to get those layers pinned nice and evenly so that you're not futzing with it later. And because this is so important to get nice and even, I'm going to sew straight up to the pin before removing the pin. So I'm going to sew straight up to the straight pin, then pull it out, and then continue on. So I'm going to continue stitching this sleeve seam, and then I'll prep the other one the same way, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, I now have 2 sleeves ready and raring to go. Both of the sleeve seams are heading towards the back of the sleeve. So you can tell the back of the sleeve by that little section right there. It's the way the sleeve is shaped. But yeah, the fold of the sleeve seam is going towards that back edge of the sleeve. I'm going to now take a quick break and go grab some more coffee and do a couple of things, and when we come back, I will set the sleeve. Good morning, welcome back to the studio. Today I'm going to set the sleeve on the gown. First off, I'm going to I've cut my shoulder straps, and now I'm going to prep them for stitching. And it's easier to do it now than futz with it later when it's on the garment. And what I'm going to do is the 3 edges that are not the shoulder edge, I'm going to fold under. And I'm going to start that by doing the lining, because I want the lining to be slightly smaller than the fashion fabric. And I've traced out my stitching line, and I've given myself 2 arrows to know not to fold that edge under. So I'm just gonna fold under and press those in place. And then this shaped edge gets eased and pulled as needed to make it around that curve. Okay. I'm also going to miter the corners. So I'm folding that point up, then folding the two edges so that I have all my raw edges nice and encased. And that's the lining done. Now, a little trick, because I want the fashion layer to be slightly larger than the lining layer. I'm going to lay the pressed lining layer down, matching that edge up that I don't want to fold under. And then I'm going to use the lining as my guide to fold my fashion layer. And that's going to give me just enough overlap. Ooh, hot. And now that I've got my edges folded, I'm going to take that lining layer out and then miter the corners on my fashion layer. And give everything a good solid press. Okay then, my shoulder straps are ready to go. I'm going to put those aside for now. And next up, we're going to tackle the setting of the sleeve to the garment. Okay, now we have the body of the gown. The gown's hanging out over here on the ironing board. There's the back neck edge right there. The shoulder strap, which is at a slight angle. The arm side, which is this curve. And then this front edge is where the front of the shoulder strap gets attached. But we won't worry about the shoulder strap just yet. We're going to set most of the sleeve first. Okay, so the two important points we're going to work with are this point right here, which is the point where the arm side meets the shoulder strap, and this point right here, that straight up and down section of the sleeve, and you can see it on the pattern. It's this section right here. This point right here matches up with that point right there every single time. Now I'm going to cut and we're going to do a close-up so that you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to be treating the two layers of the sleeve and the two layers of the bodice as one. So not keeping any of the linings separate. I'm going to match up those 2 points. Exactly like that. And then I'm going to slowly work my way around the armscye, matching up all those 4 layers. And if your seam allowances have all been trimmed nice and neatly, this is going to be a lot easier. And I need to trim off that little excess bit. And I'm being careful not to pull either of those bits of bias. Just like that. Now I'm going to prep my thread for sewing. So now I'm ready to sew. I'm in my tailor's position with my legs crossed, the work supported on my lap. My thread is prepped. I have a knot in the end, and I'm going to start at that back shoulder point, and I'm going to start inside the seam a 1/2 inch, because that's my seam line, is a 1/2 inch. So I'm coming down a 1/2 inch, which is giving me a nice point to start with. And you're going to want to do that because you're going to need to attach your shoulder strap and everything later. And you're also going to need futz room with the top of your sleeve. So coming in a 1/2 inch seam allowance and starting to sew at that point. And I'm going to use a spaced back stitch. And I'm making sure to grab all of the layers and keeping a nice 1/2 inch seam allowance. You could go down as far as a 1/4 inch to your seam allowance if you're feeling confident. I just happen to like that 1/2 inch space. So I'm coming up on the end of the seam here now, and just like the beginning of the seam, at the end of the seam I'm going to stop a 1/2 inch in from that front shoulder strap. Right about here. And I'm going to knot my thread. And then I'm going to run my thread between 2 layers and leave a tail. And that's going to give me space to sew my front shoulder strap on and also futz with this sleeve. Okay, next step, I'm going to sew my shoulder strap onto the bodice of the gown. Okay, so I have just the lining part of the shoulder strap because I'm going to work with that first. And this is the front strap edge, and I'm going to line that seam up with both the front edge of the lining and my seam line that I've basted in there. And don't worry about this excess hanging out over here. So there it is. And I'm going to sew through all 3 layers using a whip stitch. So I'm going to catch the fashion layer, the lining, and this lining, all with a little whip stitch going across. So I'm going to come up underneath the fold with a knot in my thread. Get the duff hair out of there. And I can feel on the underside where my stitches are with my finger. And I'm going to secure that edge with a knot. And then hide my tail in between the layers. And that's what the seam will look like on the inside. And that little line is going to be on the outside, but I'm going to cover it with the fashion layer. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with the back strap. So there's the back seam pinned in place. And again, I'm pinning through all 3 layers, the 2 lining layers and the fashion layer. This time, I'm matching up that outside edge and coming into roughly where I'm going to want to bind off the neck edge. And again, knotted thread, tucking in my tail. I'm going to whip stitch through all of the layers with a nice small stitch. Tail. My stitch length is about 3 millimeters or a fat 1/8 of an inch long, and I'm making them nice and even and tight. Trying not to knot my thread all up. And I'm moving things out of the way there. I don't want to catch the sleeve. I want to be able to manipulate the sleeve a little bit more. And finishing it off with a knot. And hiding my tail in between the layers. Okay, so there's my shoulder strap. Just the lining part. We're going to deal with the fashion part later. And it's stitched at the back seam and the front seam. And here's my sleeve. And we're going to work with that edge. And I'm not even going to worry about folding in my sleeve. I'm just laying it on top of that shoulder strap. And I'm going to try and lay it so that it's in that curve of the shoulder, which is going to help ease it over that shoulder. And I'm going to add, you can see what I'm doing here. I'm adding a little bit of ease there by just picking it up and moving it and creating a little bubble. And I'm working from the front strap towards the back. And the great thing about this sleeve is if you've cut it in the historical manner, it's just going to tell you where it needs to be. And I'm picking it up and creating that little bubble. And I'm pinning through all 3 layers. Can you see the ease there that I've created? Now I've got about that much left to work with, and there are pleats that go in the back of the sleeve. And I'm going to come around to the back. And fold that edge up so that it lays nicely, that back edge, and pin it in place. And then I'm going to start working my pleats. I've just made a pleat there. And another pleat, and I'm being careful to line up both my sleeve lining and my sleeve. And then I think I can get one more in. There we go. And then I'm going to put in another pin right here. So that's what the sleeve looks like. And all of this excess is just going to hang out in there, in that shoulder strap. It's not going to create bulk. It's just going to be. And then this is what it looks like on the inside. And again, that excess is just going to hang out there. And we're not even going to bother folding it under or anything. So, what I'm going to do now is, starting at that front edge, I'm going to with a running stitch, stitch through all 3 layers. The fashion layer, the lining layer of the sleeve, and then the lining layer of the strap. Okay, so on this side of the body, I'm working from the front strap, going over the sleeve. I have a knot in my thread. Where that seam is right there, that's where I know my point is, my pivot point is. So I'm going to come up underneath the fold of the sleeve there. And tuck my tail in. And what I'm doing is underneath, I'm feeling where the lining layer is for that shoulder strap, and it's coming out to about here. And I'm just going to do a running stitch, securing all 3 layers with the odd back stitch to secure. And I'm sewing through all 3 layers. And roughly 1/2 inch from that sleeve edge. And as I'm working my way across the top of the shoulder, I'm easing in that sleeve. So you can see the rounding of the sleeve there. That ease is necessary to get over the shoulder on the body. So if this was completely flat, your whole sleeve would pull the garment right off the body. And that's what you have a problem with when you're sewing a garment and the sleeve is too tight in the armhole. The whole garment will come off the body and you cannot get it to sit on the body no matter what you try if you don't have enough ease in the sleeve. And that is, very little ease, but it makes all the difference in the world. So yeah, your body's not flat. So if you made that sleeve in there without any ease in it, it just wouldn't work. I do have another video that just shows me setting a sleeve. Once again, all bodies need ease in the sleeves, and Pierre will put a link to that. And I can put my fingertips up in there, and that tells me that I know that the shoulder is going to have some place to hang out. And as we get further along towards the back of the arm side, I'm going to put in more back stitches because I want those pleats to be really nailed in place, and I don't want them to pull out as Jenny is wearing the garment. That's a stress point, so I want to make sure that it's well stitched. So now I'm just going to switch to a spaced back stitch, or a running back stitch. And I'm sewing up to the straight pin and pulling it out, because I don't want that extra bulk in my stitch, because that's going to make my stitches loose. And I'm making sure that I'm going over that pleat with a stitch to really nail it in place. And I'm going to go over that pleat again. Now we're getting down to that point where I'm going to finish the seam. You can see it right here. That's where my shoulder seam is, and that's where the sleeve is. So I'm going to work towards that point. And right here, I'm going to knot over that folded edge. And it's going to create a bit of a bar tack. And then I'm going to go up and hide the end of my thread. And that's what the sleeve looks like on the outside. And that's what the sleeve looks like on the inside. Next up, I'm going to apply the shoulder strap. This has to be the best view I have ever had for a studio, I have to say. Okay, so next up is the fashion layer of the shoulder strap. And because the edges have been pressed under and everything is nice and neat, I can just lay that on where I want it to be and pin it in place. And what I'm going to do is start with the, without losing straight pins, start with the folded edges first. So I'm going to work across the strap, then across the neck edge, and then at the very end, I'm going to fold under this edge of the shoulder edge. And what I'm going to do is actually before I fold this cut edge under, I'm going to sew along that front shoulder strap, along the neck edge, and then along the back shoulder strap. And I'll trim this off and fold it under as I need to. And some of you may notice that my band-aid has changed. And that's because I tried to grate my thumb the other night. And I have rough skin that's catching on things. So I've been covering it with a band-aid. But the band-aid was catching on things just as badly. So I changed out the band-aid. Because there is nothing worse than your work sticking to your thumb. And you may also notice that I changed the side where my straight pins are going. And that's because I'm going to switch the side where I'm going to be sewing as I'm sewing. Ooh, that's going to be a snug little point, but it's going to work. Okay. So starting at that front point, I'm going to come up underneath that fold to hide my knot. And hide the tail. And I'm going to whip stitch across with a little tiny whip stitch. Following the same seam that the lining took. Like I can see my stitching line right there. And I'm just covering it. I want that edge to meet nice and neatly. Not in my thread. Here we go. So I'm going to take an extra whip stitch right there at the edge. And then I'm going to flip the work over and fell my lining to my fashion layer. And that first couple of stitches is going through a few layers, so I'm going to stab stitch. Just to nail everything in place. Okay. going through, picking up all of the fashion layer, and then just the fold of the lining. And I'm making this stitch nice and snug because part of this shoulder strap is a bit on the bias and I want it to be stable. So I'm easing up that seam edge. Now I'm going to transition back over to the top side. And I'm changing the direction so that I can find it easier to sew. And then I'm going to whip stitch along the back seam. Oh, my thread just broke.
Duff.
And I'm just going to stitch up to that straight pin so that I have room to manipulate the fold. There's your shoulder strap stitched in place. Okay, so now that the fashion layer of the shoulder strap is in place, I'm going to fold under that last edge on the sleeve side. And I'm going to start in the middle and work my way out so that I've folded it under nice and evenly. I don't want to start at one end and work my way to the other because then it might twist. And I'm smoothing it out carefully from the neck edge. And it's good to take your time at this point and really pin it in place well and make sure you're happy with it before you start sewing. Okay, so I'm going to come up underneath that fold and hide my knot and hide my tail. Scoot that tail in there. There we go. And then very close to the edge, I'm going to work a spaced back stitch, going through as many layers as you can. To nail everything down. And there's a lot of layers right here. And take your time and make your stitches nice and even, remembering not to sew over your straight pins. You can't really do this sleeve by machine because all of the handwork that you're doing is creating ease, and if you were to force this through a sewing machine, you would lose all of that shaping and all of that ease. You'll notice that I'm sewing with a cup to the seam line, using my hands to shape as I'm working. And a sewing machine would just flatten that right out. Or worse, cup it in the wrong direction. Very carefully going to hold that corner in place. While I stitch my last couple of stitches. And now I'm going to finish that little bit of back shoulder strap that I wanted to keep unstitched until I got my edge folded under. Finishing with a knot, and then scooting my tail up in between the 2 layers, or 6 layers, and finishing off my thread. So there's one sleeve set and in place. I'm going to go ahead now and do the other sleeve. I'll catch you in a few minutes. Okay, so now the 2 sleeves are on, and I'm going to finish up this segment of this particular video. Tomorrow I'm going to tackle binding the back neck, and then lots and lots and lots of floofy decoration. I have a whole pile of cloth to make into decoration, so that'll be in the next video. If you obviously like what you've seen because you've been with me through 3 videos now, please hit the subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and if you want, dingle the bell there to get notifications for the next video. So, like I said, the next video will be the back neck binding and lots of decoration. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow.